Hey guys, today I'm going to show you a step-by-step process of creating a rigid epoxy mold over an oil-based clay sculpt so we can create many silicone castings of Slimer. So let's just jump into it and see how it's done. Now, before we start a project like this, you of course want to first take a minute and think about the project. What are your end result goals? What do we want to create? I went ahead and divided the mold that we're creating by using a dotted line with a Sharpie, and that's where we're going to insert the aluminum shims that are going to separate the different parts of our epoxy mold. Now, the decisions that I made for these separation lines off the support shell are very strategic in a sense that they're either going to be hidden and hard to see once their casting is made, or they're strategically placed so that we can demold certain sections, or we want to avoid a certain section of placing any separation lines, seam lines, so that we don't have to clean it potentially on an area that's very visible, like on the face. The shims I'm using here are made out of aluminum flashing. This is what you're going to find in a hardware store, usually in the roofing section. Now, keep in mind this aluminum flashing is available in different thicknesses, and I find a thinner stock easier to work and cut into. Also, it creates a smaller, thinner seam line in your mold that will be visible in your castings coming out of the mold. So I first want to set keys in and then fill in the areas in between the keyed sections. And that goes for the entire build. Remember, you want to take time to think all the steps through, including the demolding process, to make sure that all components will be easy to remove and work with once the mold is complete. This is why the mouth section here is divided in 3, so that once we make the mold, we can also demold it, because the mouth cavity is actually larger than the mouth opening itself. So make sure that you plan that out before actually starting the molding process. Here we have the finished result of what that should look like after inserting all the shims into the original sculpt. So now that we have divided our model using the aluminum shims in different sections, we can proceed to making our rigid epoxy mold. Because we are working with epoxy products, we do want to make sure that everything does release from this buildup here, from the separation shims. And for that, we're going to use the Ease Release 200, and we're going to apply a layer of the release agent along the entire perimeter of the separation lines, the shims themselves, and then the model as well. Once we apply the release agent, we're going to allow it to dry for 15 minutes before proceeding on to the next step. To start making our composite mold, we first need to mix a print coat or gel coat or beauty coat, some call it, and for that we're using the EpoxAcoat Gray. This first thickened material will capture all the detail of our original sculpt. When using the EpoxAcoat Gray with the 101 Fast Hardener, you have a working time of 20 minutes and a tack-free time of 4 hours, while the product cures in 16 hours. So we want to make sure that we apply more material before the 4-hour tack-free time has expired. The EpoxAcoat Gray is allowed 1 hour partial cure before moving on to the next step. Keep the working time of the material that you're working with in mind when working on larger projects. You don't want to mix too much material that you cannot apply and then have it solidify in your mixing container. The EpoxAcoat Gray is brushed on using a chip brush against the detail of our sculpt. I go slowly but thoroughly working along the perimeter of the section that I selected. So again, here I'm just going to work from the top down. Keep in mind that the material like this likes to slump a little bit. So work from the top down and keep the wet material moving downwards, pressing it against the detail of your sculpt. Keep in mind that we're not using a stippling technique here in order not to disturb the detail of our sculpt. Something that's worth mentioning here is the fact that when you divide your model into sections like this, you can continuously keep working on your sections. While the material is setting up in one section, you can focus on applying a different material in another section. This way we can minimize the downtime while we're waiting for our sections and material to set up. Now, once the material is completely applied to a section, we can allow that a partial cure for 60 minutes before moving on to the next step. The next step of making our composite mold is to add some freeform air. So what we're going to be doing is mixing up some freeform air, and we're going to apply it over the entire surface where we applied the EpoxAcoat gray, starting with the keys of our mold. So filling in those keys to make sure that they have a solid filling to align with the other half of the mold. And then we're going to proceed by applying a layer of the freeform air over the entire surface. I like to keep this layer of the freeform air to a thickness of 3/8 of an inch to 1/2 an inch throughout. When applied at 3/8 of an inch, the freeform air has a working time or pot life of 60 minutes, while the cure time takes 24 hours. We're going to allow this material a partial cure of 1 hour before applying additional material. To sandwich our composite mold with a final layer of epoxy, we're going to use the epoxamite with the 102 medium hardener. This is a laminating epoxy. Now, the reason why we're using the 102 medium hardener is because we're working on a large surface and we're applying epoxy and glass fiber. So we're doing 2 steps, and we want to have enough working time with the material, which is 90 minutes of working time in a thin film, to apply the material and then apply the glass cloth over it. So always make sure you understand the working time of material, how much work time you have, and the area that you're trying to cover. And we're going to mix it up and then apply it to our freeform air layer, in which then we're going to add some glass fibers to reinforce the overall structure. Right now, the overall structure is strong because it's epoxy, but because it's such a long shape and it's going to have some bending and twisting, we want to make sure we follow up with a layer of epoxy and glass fiber. It's going to make our mold much stronger. So once we apply a layer of the epoxy to the freeform air, we can then lay in the glass fiber. This is glass fiber cloth that I've already pre-cut into different lengths and sections. So you can see that once you lay it into the glass, you can then use a little bit more epoxy and push the epoxy through the glass fiber. That process is called impregnating the glass fiber with the material, with epoxy. So here I'm going to follow through and cover the entire section that we built up here with a layer of glass fiber and epoxy. This section is now allowed 24 hours to cure before moving on to the next step. After 24 hours, we're ready to remove some of those separation shims, the aluminum shims, so that we can make the next section of that mold. So we can remove the aluminum shims once we are ready for that section of the mold to be worked on. And here you can see that the back of the mold is already complete, and so is also the mouthpiece. So the mouthpiece itself, as you can see, is broken down into 3 sections. Now, once all the shims are removed, we can follow up with some Ease Release 200 on the already made sections of the mold. So these are the sections that I exposed are made with the EpoxAcoat gray. That's what we're exposing here and putting some release agent. And here I'm using a spray brush spray technique to make sure that all these sections actually release from each other. We are putting epoxy against epoxy, and it's really important that these halves do come apart. The Ease Release 200 is allowed 5 minutes to dry before applying more epoxy over it. Now, just like we did previously, we're going to mix up another batch of the EpoxAcoat gray. As always, mix thoroughly, scrape the sides, scrape the bottom, And again, we're going to start by working our way from the top down. So easy, soft brush strokes, no stippling on this application. We don't want to disturb the surface of the original sculpt. And I'm just going to go over the entire surface here. This is the last section of the mold. And you can see I went over the eyes and all the clay that was still exposed. Now, before you ask what those bolts are in his eyes, they are bolted onto a fake eyeball, onto a urethane resin eyeball that's basically keeping the shape of the eyeball hollow in our casting. So once we remove the mold, those eyeballs are going to be permanently in the mold and are going to create a hollow where we're going to set epoxy eyes into when the project is finished. The first layer of the EpoxAcoat gray is now allowed to partially cure for 1 hour. Now, just like we did on previous sections, we're going to mix up some freeform air and we're going to apply it over the entire build that we did. So all the sections that we coated with the EpoxAcoat gray are now getting a 3/8 of an inch layer of the freeform air. 3/8 of an inch is about 1 centimeter. Note that I added a metal handle to the first piece out of the 3 pieces in the mouth mold. That's going to allow us to much easier remove that first piece and demold the mold mouth cavity. And here you can see I'm using a little bit of water out of a spray bottle to smooth out the surface of the freeform air. This is going to make the application of the epoxy and glass fiber that's going to go over the top here a much easier fit because there's no sharp edges and ridges. And then we're going to allow this a partial cure for 1 hour before proceeding on to the next step. And just like we did on the previous layers, we're going to finalize this mold by applying a layer of Epoxamite 102. This is a laminating epoxy. Once mixed, I'm going to spread it over the entire surface. Keep in mind that these exothermic materials like epoxies have a longer working time when you spread them thin over large surfaces than if you have them in a mixing cup where they're concentrated. And again, we're going to go over the entire mold buildup here over the freeform air with a layer of glass fiber and epoxy. When creating composites mold like this, where we layer different materials over each other, we want to make sure to minimize any kind of air voids in between those layers. Air voids will create weak areas in your mold and lead to premature failure of a mold. So make sure that the glass fiber pieces overlap but are pressed tightly against each other and don't have any air voids. Once this is applied, we're going to allow it a full cure of 24 hours before moving on to the next step. Once the epoxy layers have bonded and cured fully together, we can go ahead and demold our original. And we're going to start the demolding process by sanding down the edges so that we don't cut our hands on the rigid, sharp epoxy corners. So here you can see I'm going over it with the sander one more time, checking all the edges with my gloved hands so that I cut myself. And then we're going to put some holes along the perimeter. These holes are going to be there to bolt the entire support shell, or mold in this case, to bolt the mold together so that we can cast into it. Now onto the demolding process. This is a slow step-by-step process. Here I'm borrowing some hands to help me out, to make sure I don't break anything. And we're going to remove the sections of the mold slowly. So we're going to pry them open slowly, not to break anything. And there it is. The sections are coming apart. And one thing I discovered to remove all this oil-based clay, the easiest thing that you could do is to warm it up. So if you have a heating oven that you can put the entire mold into, that's what is recommended because it's going to make the removal process of the clay much easier. Now, once we've removed most of the clay by scraping it out using soft tools, we can proceed to removing the last bits of the clay that still remain in the detail of our mold. And for that, we're going to use a short bristle brush or scrubbing brush with hard bristles and some mineral spirits. We're going to soak the clay with the mineral spirits, soften it up, scrape them with the brush out of the mold, and then follow up with a last wipe of mineral spirits with a paper towel to remove any of the last residue. We are actually ready for the casting process. The mold can be put together. We're going to bolt everything together and get it ready for the casting process to cast silicone into it. Now, if you got inspired by this project and you'd like to give your own projects a go and need some material, you can visit any one of our distributors around the world. So guys, there you have it, a step-by-step procedure that I took to create a rigid epoxy mold for our casting of Slimer here that is nice, soft silicone. Now, if you have an idea about what we should do next, please let us know down in the comments below. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up button. To keep up with our latest mold making, casting, and other videos, remember to subscribe.